have spent the better part of my adult life building things, not in a professional sense, though I have done my share of professional building over the years. I mean building in the private, personal sense, the kind of building that a man does on his own property, with his own hands, on weekends and early mornings and late evenings when the light is still good, building something that is entirely his and that represents exactly what he intended it to represent. My father built things. His father built things. There is something in the men of my family that does not feel right unless there is a project underway, something being shaped into existence, something that did not exist before and will exist after. I inherited that from them, and I do not apologize for it. What I built on the eastern side of my property on Haverford Lane was, by any reasonable measure, the most beautiful thing I have ever grown. I use the word grown deliberately because that is what you do with hedges. You grow them, not build them, at least not in the beginning. You put living things in the ground and you tend them and you wait and you adjust and you tend some more. And over years, they become what you imagined when you first stood at the edge of the bed with a spade in your hand and a plan in your head. My hedges were English laurel, planted in 2 staggered rows along the full length of my eastern property line, 58 feet from the front corner of my house to the back fence. I planted them 17 years ago. I tended them for 17 years. And what they became, in those 17 years of care, was something that stopped people on the sidewalk to look, dense and dark green, shaped into a gentle arc that was flat on top and slightly bowed on the face, about 11 feet tall at the peak, catching morning light in a way that made the texture of the foliage look almost liquid. I am not being sentimental about this. I am being precise. They were exceptional, and I knew they were exceptional, and I also knew that the person who destroyed them knew they were exceptional, which is the part of this story that matters most. Her name was Claudia Merritt. She was the president of the Haverford Commons HOA, and she had been looking at my hedges with something I can only describe as acquisitive displeasure for approximately 5 of the 17 years I had been growing them. Not because they were in violation of anything, they were not, or at least they were not until Claudia decided they should be. Not because they caused any harm to anyone, they did not and had never done so. She looked at them the way certain people look at beautiful things that belong to someone they have decided to dislike, with the specific expression of a person who has concluded that the beautiful thing should not exist and is working on the justification. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I do not dislike HOAs in principle. I have lived in governed communities my entire adult life, and when they function as they are supposed to function, as a cooperative mechanism by which neighbors maintain shared standards for their mutual benefit, they are genuinely valuable. The Haverford Commons HOA, before Claudia Merritt, had been exactly that kind of organization. Functional, reasonable, largely invisible in the day-to-day life of the neighborhood because it did not need to be visible. It handled the entrance maintenance and the pond care and the occasional dispute that required a third-party perspective, and it did so without drama or overreach. Claudia Merritt became HOA president 7 years ago, and the HOA changed. It did not change overnight. These things never do. It changed the way water changes a landscape, gradually, so that the people experiencing it did not always register how different things had become until they were standing in a place that felt nothing like where they started. By year 3 of Claudia's presidency, the HOA was a different organization than it had been, and by year 5, it was unrecognizable to anyone who had been in the neighborhood long enough to remember what came before. I had been in the neighborhood for 10 years before Claudia arrived. I had seen what came before. I recognized the difference. My name is Gerald Patterson. I am 58 years old. I retired 2 years ago from a career in municipal engineering, water infrastructure, specifically, which requires a particular combination of technical precision and regulatory knowledge that I will explain is directly relevant to how this story ends. I bought my house on Haverford Lane when I was 41, newly single after a marriage that had not worked out, in need of a place that had space for the projects I had in mind. The house was right, the lot was right, the neighborhood was right, at least at the time. I moved in, I planted my hedges, I met my neighbors, and I built myself a life there that suited me well. For the first 5 years of Claudia's presidency, I maintained a careful neutrality. I paid my dues, I attended the occasional meeting, I kept my property in meticulous order, and I observed without engaging. Claudia was difficult. I think most people in the neighborhood understood this privately even when they declined to say it publicly, but she was difficult in ways that were distributed enough that no single homeowner bore the full weight of it. She sent violation notices, she amended guidelines, she made demands that ranged from the trivial to the genuinely invasive, but she spread her attention broadly enough that each individual homeowner could tell themselves it was not personal. Then she fixed her attention on me, and I discovered that it was a different experience when the attention was concentrated. The first notice arrived in my 5th year of Claudia's presidency. My hedges at that point were 12 years old and approximately 10 feet tall. The notice said they were in violation of Section 9, Paragraph B of the updated community guidelines, which restricted side yard vegetation to 8 feet in height on properties that shared a lot line with the community common area. My eastern lot line did share a line with a community green space, a narrow strip of maintained grass that ran behind the row of houses on my side of the street. The updated guidelines, Claudia explained in the notice, were concerned with maintaining sight lines across the common area. I reviewed Section 9. The 8-foot restriction was there. I looked at the amendment history and found that the restriction had been added 18 months earlier in an amendment that I had not closely tracked because I had not understood its implications for my property. I should have tracked it more carefully. I acknowledge this. I trimmed the hedges to 8 feet. It was painful in the way that cutting back established growth is always painful for a person who has grown it. You are removing years of work in hours, but the plants were healthy enough to handle it, and I was, at that point, still committed to compliance as the path of least resistance. I documented the trimming, sent photographs to the HOA, and received a compliance acknowledgement. For 2 more years, nothing happened. I maintained the hedges at 8 feet. I watched them recover their shape and density at the new height. They were not what they had been at 10 feet, but they were still beautiful, still the thing that made my side yard what it was, still worth the years I had put into them. In the 7th year of Claudia's presidency, she amended the guidelines again. This time, the amendment addressed what she called the community sightline standard, and it introduced a new provision requiring that vegetation along lot lines adjacent to community common areas be permeable, meaning that a person standing on the common area should be able to see through the vegetation at any point along its length. My hedges, solid and dense from ground to tip, were by definition not permeable. The amendment gave homeowners 6 months to achieve compliance. There is no way to make a solid English laurel hedge permeable without destroying it. English laurel is not a plant that grows in a way that allows for permeability. Its density is its nature, built into the way it branches and leaves. You can thin a laurel hedge, but you cannot make it permeable. What you can do is remove it, and that was, I understood clearly, what this amendment was designed to accomplish. I submitted a written objection to the HOA. I documented my 17-year history of maintaining the hedges, the compliance trimming I had done 2 years earlier under the previous amendment, and my professional assessment as a retired engineer of the sightline justification, which I found to be unsupported by any actual safety or utility concern related to the narrow decorative green strip that ran behind my property. I requested a variance hearing. The variance hearing was scheduled, conducted, and decided in exactly the way I had expected once I understood how Claudia ran these proceedings. She was present as the presiding officer. She allowed me to speak for 5 minutes. She asked 2 questions that were not really questions, but framings of her predetermined conclusion. The variance was denied. I drove home from the variance hearing, and I sat in my side yard for a long time, looking at the hedges. They were 8 feet tall and dense, and dark green, and they were, I thought, probably going to be the last thing I looked at calmly for a while, because I had just been told they were going to have to come down, and I was not going to let that happen without doing everything I could to prevent it. That night I called an attorney named Robert Fitch, who specialized in community association law and whom I had known professionally for years through his work on various municipal projects that intersected with my engineering work. I explained the situation. Robert listened carefully and then asked several specific questions about the amendment procedure, the notice methodology, and the voting record. I told him I would get him everything I had. I pulled every piece of HOA documentation I owned, meeting minutes, amendment notices, compliance letters, everything, and I organized it and sent it to Robert. He came back to me in 10 days with a preliminary assessment that I want to describe carefully because it has two parts and both parts matter. The first part was discouraging. The permeable vegetation amendment, from a purely substantive standpoint, was within the HOA's authority to set community standards. The sightline justification was thin but not non-existent, and courts in our state had generally given HOAs significant deference in setting aesthetic and safety standards. Fighting the amendment directly on substantive grounds would be expensive and uncertain. The second part was different. Robert had been looking at the procedural history, and what he found was significant. The Haverford Commons bylaws required that amendments to the community guidelines be voted on at a duly noticed annual or special meeting with a quorum of at least 40% of homeowners in person or by proxy. The permeable vegetation amendment had been voted on at a special meeting. Robert had obtained the attendance record for that meeting. Of the 92 homeowners in Haverford Commons, 14 had been present in person. 6 had submitted proxies. That was 20 total, 22% of homeowners, not 40%. The meeting had not reached quorum. The amendment had been passed without quorum. I read Robert's assessment 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. The permeable vegetation amendment, the amendment that required me to destroy my hedges, had been voted on at a meeting that did not have enough homeowners present to legally conduct binding business. The vote was void. The amendment was void. The hedges were not subject to the amendment because the amendment did not exist as a matter of law. I called Robert and said that was excellent news and what happened next. He said we send a letter to the HOA explaining the quorum deficiency and demanding withdrawal of the amendment and the compliance order. And in parallel, we start looking at the structural alternatives, because even if we got the amendment withdrawn, Claudia Merritt was still HOA president, and she was going to keep looking for ways to achieve what she was trying to achieve with the hedges. That was when I asked Robert the question I had been building toward, since I first started thinking about this problem from an engineering rather than a legal standpoint. I asked him what, in the Haverford Commons guidelines, governed structures as opposed to vegetation. He looked it up. Section 13, fences and walls permitted up to 6 feet on side and rear lot lines, decorative structures permitted up to 4 feet in front yards, structural planters not specifically addressed. I asked him whether a masonry structure, specifically a reinforced concrete masonry wall, built to the maximum permitted height of 6 feet along my eastern lot line, would be subject to the vegetation guidelines in any form. He said no, a masonry wall was a structure. The vegetation guidelines applied to plants. A wall was not a plant. I asked him whether a wall could support vegetation, specifically whether I could install planters or growing systems on top of or attached to a permitted wall. He said the guidelines did not address vegetation attached to structures. They addressed freestanding vegetation in the ground. I told Robert I was going to need a structural engineer and a concrete contractor. He said he would send the letter to the HOA first, and that I should hold off on the construction planning until we saw how they responded, because if they withdrew the amendment voluntarily, it would simplify things. They did not withdraw it voluntarily. The letter Robert sent was detailed and precise. It documented the quorum deficiency with the attendance figures and the bylaw requirements, stated that the amendment was void on procedural grounds, and demanded withdrawal of both the amendment and the compliance order within 15 days. Claudia responded through the HOA attorney, a man named Douglas Hale, who made 2 arguments. The first was that the attendance figures Robert had used were incorrect, and that the meeting had actually reached quorum through a combination of in-person attendance and proxies that had been properly submitted. The second was that even if there was a procedural question about the amendment, the underlying sightline policy was valid and enforceable. Robert requested the proxy documentation. It took Douglas Hale 2 weeks to produce it, which was itself informative. When he produced it, Robert spent an afternoon going through the proxy forms and found that 4 of the 6 proxies submitted had procedural defects. They were not notarized as required by the Haverford Commons proxy form requirements, and 2 of them had been submitted after the deadline specified in the meeting notice. Without those 4 proxies, the meeting attendance dropped to 17%, still well below the 40% quorum requirement. Robert sent a second letter. This one was shorter and more pointed. It stated the corrected attendance figures, identified the defective proxies, confirmed the quorum deficiency, and stated that we would be filing for a declaratory judgment in county court if the amendment was not withdrawn within 10 days. Douglas Hale asked for a meeting. The meeting happened at Robert's office. Douglas brought Claudia. Robert brought me and the full documentation file. The meeting lasted about 90 minutes and was, for most of its duration, a methodical walk through the procedural record, with Robert laying out the documentation and Douglas acknowledging, one piece at a time, that the numbers did not add up to quorum. Claudia sat at the end of the table and said very little, which was not her natural mode, and which told me more about how the meeting was going than anything the attorneys said. At the end of the meeting, Douglas asked what we wanted. Robert said 3 things: formal withdrawal of the permeable vegetation amendment and all associated compliance orders, a written commitment from the HOA that no further compliance action would be taken regarding my hedges pending any future amendment that was properly enacted with full quorum, and a review by the HOA of its amendment and meeting procedure practices going forward. Douglas said he would take that back to his client. 3 days later, he called Robert and said the HOA would agree to the amendment withdrawal and the compliance order cancellation, but was not prepared to commit to the procedural review as a formal matter. Robert told him the procedural review was non-negotiable. I want to pause here and explain why that was non-negotiable for me, because it would have been easy to take the partial win, get my hedges protected, move on, let the procedural practices slide. The reason it was non-negotiable is that the quorum deficiency in the permeable vegetation amendment was not the first procedural irregularity I had found in Claudia's amendment history. When Robert had done his initial review of the documentation I sent him, he had flagged 2 other amendments from earlier in Claudia's presidency that had similar meeting attendance questions. I had not pushed those at the meeting because I wanted to focus the negotiation, but they were real, and they suggested that the quorum issue was not an isolated mistake, but a pattern. Other homeowners had been required to comply with amendments that may have been passed without proper quorum. If I did not make the procedural review part of the resolution, those homeowners would remain subject to potentially void rules. Douglas went back again. He called Robert 2 days later. The HOA would agree to a procedural audit of all amendments passed during the current administration, conducted by an independent community association attorney, with results reported to the full homeowner community. In exchange for that agreement, we would not pursue the declaratory judgment filing and would withdraw our procedural challenge. Robert recommended accepting. I accepted. And then I told Robert I was still building the wall. He asked if I was sure, given that the hedges were now protected. I said yes, I was sure, not out of anger, not out of spite, out of the understanding that the hedges were protected today, under today's agreement, and that Claudia Merritt was still HOA president, and that she had tried 3 times to take my hedges away from me and had been stopped 3 times not by any change in her intentions, but by the combination of procedural defects and my willingness to fight. The next time, and there would be a next time, because people like Claudia do not stop, they regroup, I wanted something in place that she genuinely could not touch, not protected by legal technicalities, protected by the nature of what it was. A concrete masonry wall, built to code, with a valid building permit, complying with the HOA's own structural guidelines. That was something she genuinely could not touch. I hired my structural engineer. a woman named Diana Cho, whom I had worked with on several municipal projects, and I described what I wanted. A reinforced concrete masonry wall, 6 feet tall, running the full 58 feet of my eastern property line. Standard concrete masonry units, cinder blocks, with a continuous footing, vertical rebar in grouted cores, horizontal joint reinforcement, and a cast-in-place concrete cap. Structurally, this was not a complicated wall. It was a standard reinforced masonry partition, the kind of thing built in commercial and light industrial construction every day. Diana stamped the drawings in about a week. I pulled the building permit. The building department reviewed the drawings, and the permit was approved in 8 days. I contracted the construction to a masonry crew I found through a colleague, a small company run by 2 brothers named Antonio and Carlos Reyes, who had been doing masonry work in the area for 20 years and who, when I described the project and showed them the drawings, said they could start in 3 weeks. While I was waiting for the construction start, I thought about the surface treatment. A plain concrete masonry wall is functional and permanent, but not particularly beautiful. I was not going to build something on my property that I had to look at every day if I could build something better. Diana and I discussed options. We settled on a stucco finish on the side facing my yard, a smooth, hand-troweled stucco in a warm sand color, with a slightly textured top quarter of the wall height that would give it a visual scale break, and a standard painted finish on the neighbor's side in a neutral off-white that would be inoffensive and easy to maintain. The cap would be cast concrete, tinted slightly darker than the stucco, with a rounded profile to shed water cleanly. On top of the cap, at intervals of approximately 30 inches, I planned a series of custom concrete planters, cast in place, integrated into the cap, each 112 inches wide and 18 inches deep, running the full length of the wall like a continuous interrupted band. In those planters, I would grow a variety of climbing and cascading plants that would, over time, soften the wall surface, introduce color and texture, and create something that was simultaneously a solid permanent structure and a living garden element. Antonio and Carlos arrived on a Tuesday morning with their crew and a loaded flatbed. The footing excavation and concrete pour happened in the first 2 days. The block work started on day 3 and proceeded steadily. The Reyes brothers ran a clean, organized crew, each course set with care, the mortar joints consistent, the wall rising plumb and level in a way that, to an engineer's eye, was genuinely satisfying to watch. The grout pour happened at the end of day 5. The cap form was set on day 6, and the cap was poured on day 7. The crew came back on day 10 to strip the forms, apply the stucco finish on my side, and seal the painted finish on the neighbor's side. The integrated planters were formed and poured on day 11 as the final operation. On day 12, I walked the full length of the wall, and I looked at what was there, and I thought about the 17 years that had preceded it and everything that had happened in the last several months, and I felt something that I want to try to describe accurately. It was not triumph. It was not relief, exactly, though it was partly that. What it was, more than anything, was the feeling of a thing being permanently decided. Not temporarily decided, not decided pending the next amendment cycle, not decided until Claudia found another angle. Permanently decided. The wall was there. It was built correctly. It had a permit. It complied with every applicable guideline. It was going to be there when I was gone. That feeling, I think, is what my father meant when he talked about building things that last. The wall was completed on a Friday afternoon, and by the following Monday, Claudia Merritt knew about it. I know she knew because she walked past my property on Monday morning. I saw her from my kitchen window, making no pretense of having any other reason to be on my side of the street, and she stopped at the end of my driveway and looked at the wall for a very long time. From where I was standing, I could see her expression clearly enough. It was not the expression of a person who had encountered something unexpected. It was the expression of a person who recognized what they were looking at and understood what it meant, and was trying, in real time, to determine what could be done about it. I went back to my coffee. Whatever she concluded, she was going to conclude it without me watching from the window. What she concluded, as it turned out, was that she was going to push the HOA to issue a violation notice about the wall. The notice arrived 11 days after construction was complete. It said that the wall was a non-compliant structure under Section 13 of the Community Guidelines, which permitted side yard walls up to 6 feet in height. The wall, the notice said, exceeded 6 feet. I got out a tape measure and measured the wall, 5 feet 11 inches to the top of the masonry. The concrete cap added 2.5 inches. Total, 6 feet, 1.5 inches. The cap was 1.5 inches over the 6-foot limit. I called Robert. He reviewed Section 13 and confirmed that the height limit applied to the structure in total, including any cap or coping. The cap had put me 1.5 inches over. I called Antonio Reyes. He came over that afternoon, looked at the cap, and said he could grind it down. It would take half a day and would require resurfacing the cap, but it was doable. I asked him to do it. Antonio ground the cap down by 2 inches, bringing the total wall height to 5 feet 11.5 inches. He resurfaced the cap, which actually looked cleaner than the original pour. I measured 5 feet 11.5 inches, under 6 feet by half an inch. I sent documentation to the HOA, measurements, photographs, Antonio's work order, and requested a formal compliance acknowledgement. The compliance acknowledgement did not arrive on the schedule I expected. Instead, I received a letter from Douglas Hale, the HOA's attorney, stating that the HOA was conducting a further review of the wall's compliance with Section 13 and that additional concerns had been identified. The letter cited, as a basis for further review, the integrated planters on top of the wall cap. It stated that the planters, if their contents were considered as part of the structure's effective height, might push the total height above the 6-foot limit. The letter asked me to respond to this concern within 15 days. I read this letter twice, and then I set it down and sat with it for a while, because what it was describing was legally novel and practically creative in a way that I had to respect even as I intended to defeat it. The argument was that the planters, 12 inches wide, 18 inches deep, filled with growing medium, constituted an upward extension of the wall structure, such that the total height of wall plus planter exceeded 6 feet. If that argument held, I would need to remove the planters. I called Robert and read him the letter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They're arguing that a planter is part of the wall's height." "Yes," I said. "A planter with soil in it," he said, "a vessel for growing plants." "Correct," I said. "Gerald," he said, "a planter is not a structural element. A planter is a container. By their logic, a window box on the second floor of a house is part of the house's height." "I thought something similar," I said. "I'm going to draft a response," he said. "This is not going to be difficult, but I'm also going to do something else. The procedural audit we negotiated, the one of all the amendments passed under Claudia's administration, has been moving forward with the independent auditor. I've been receiving preliminary findings. I want to share something with you." He shared the preliminary findings with me the next day. I want to take a moment with this because it is the part of the story that is not just about me and my wall, and it matters. The independent auditor reviewing Claudia's amendment history had gone through 6 years of amendment votes. There were 19 amendments in that period. Of the 19, the auditor had identified 7 with potential quorum deficiencies similar to the one Robert had found in the permeable vegetation amendment. 7 of 19 amendments. The auditor had also found 2 amendments where the notice period had not met the bylaw requirement, and 1 amendment where the text of the amendment as voted on differed from the text of the amendment as published in the subsequent guidelines revision, meaning the written rule did not match what the homeowners had actually voted on. 10 out of 19 amendments with procedural problems of one kind or another. The 7 quorum-deficient amendments included, among others, the restriction that had reduced my hedge height from 10 feet to 8 feet. It included the fence color restriction that had required a homeowner named Paul Whitfield to repaint a fence he had installed 2 years prior. It included the outdoor structure permit requirement that had required another homeowner to retroactively permit a garden shed he had built without knowing a permit was required by HOA standards. It included the short-term rental prohibition that had affected at least 4 homeowners who used their properties occasionally as rental income. The preliminary audit findings were, in Robert's words, a substantial problem for the HOA. He sent our response to Douglas Hale about the planter height issue on the same day he forwarded me the audit summary. The response was concise. It cited case law establishing that planters and containers are not structural elements for the purpose of building height calculations. It noted that the HOA's own guidelines distinguished between structures and vegetation elements, and it stated that any attempt to enforce a height violation based on planter contents would be contested immediately and would not succeed. He also noted, in the final paragraph, that he was aware the procedural audit was ongoing and that its preliminary findings raised significant questions about the validity of multiple amendments that had been enforced against homeowners in the community, and that we expected to discuss those findings in a comprehensive resolution framework in the near future. Douglas Hale called Robert 2 days after receiving the letter. He did not call about the planter issue, he called about the audit findings. The conversation, Robert told me, was one in which Douglas was clearly managing a situation that had gotten considerably larger than he had expected when he first took on the HOA as a client. The audit findings were not just a problem for me. They were a problem for every homeowner who had been required to comply with one of the 7 quorum-deficient amendments. Paul Whitfield had repainted his fence at a cost of several $1,000s. The homeowner with the garden shed had paid a retroactive permit fee and an HOA fine. The homeowners affected by the short-term rental prohibition had lost rental income over a period of years. The exposure for the HOA, if all of those homeowners brought claims based on the invalid amendments, was substantial. Douglas asked whether there was a resolution framework that could address the situation comprehensively. Robert said yes, and he had some ideas. The resolution framework that Robert negotiated over the following 6 weeks was the most complex legal settlement I have ever been involved in, and I spent 20 years in municipal engineering where complex settlements were not unusual. It had the following components, which I will walk through carefully. First, the 7 quorum-deficient amendments were formally voided and removed from the HOA guidelines. The affected rules reverted to whatever had been in place prior to each voided amendment. In my case, this meant that the side yard vegetation height limit reverted to 10 feet, the limit that had applied before Claudia's first hedge height amendment, which had been among the 7 voided. My hedges, maintained at 8 feet, were now 2 feet under the applicable limit. Second, the HOA established a remediation fund, funded by the HOA's insurance carrier, to compensate homeowners who had incurred direct costs in complying with the voided amendments. Paul Whitfield's fence repainting cost was covered. The garden shed permit fee and fine were refunded. The short-term rental homeowners received a calculation of lost income based on documented rental history. My trimming costs and the diminished value assessment for my hedges were included in the fund. Third, the HOA adopted a formal amendment procedure that required not just quorum at the vote, but pre-vote confirmation that quorum had been achieved through a verified sign-in and proxy validation process, with results documented before any vote was conducted. This was, from a governance standpoint, simply how things should have been operating from the beginning. The fact that it needed to be formally adopted as a new requirement was an indication of how far from basic good practice the HOA had drifted. Fourth, and this was the part that I had insisted on and that Robert had fought for through 2 rounds of negotiation. The HOA's guidelines were amended to include an established plantings protection provision. This provision stated that vegetation that had been legally installed and maintained in compliance with the guidelines in effect at the time of installation was entitled to grandfather protection, meaning that new height, species, or character restrictions could not be applied retroactively to require removal or reduction of established plantings. New plantings would be subject to current guidelines. Established plantings were protected. This provision did not exist anywhere in the Haverford Commons guidelines before. It did not exist in most HOA guidelines. It was not a standard provision. It was something I had asked Robert to draft specifically because I was not going to resolve a 6-year fight over my hedges with an agreement that only protected my hedges. I wanted a provision that would protect every homeowner in Haverford Commons from having a future HOA president due to their established plantings, what Claudia had tried to do to mine. Robert said it was ambitious. I said I understood that. He said he would try. He got it. The HOA accepted it as a condition of the comprehensive resolution because their insurance carrier had made clear that the alternative fighting 7 simultaneous homeowner claims based on invalid amendments was going to cost significantly more than settling comprehensively. The resolution was signed on a Thursday afternoon in Robert's office. Douglas Hale was there. Claudia Merritt was not. I did not ask where she was. It was not my concern. I drove home and I walked my property for a while in the early evening light. The wall was on my right as I walked the eastern side of the yard. 6 feet of reinforced concrete masonry, sand-colored stucco, the concrete cap catching the late sun, the planters along the top beginning to show the first growth from the climbing plants I had installed in them 2 weeks earlier. The hedges were on the other side of the wall, on the lot line side, 11 feet of English laurel. They had grown 3 feet in the past year without trimming, recovering toward their natural height, and they were already beginning to recover the quality they had had before the first cutback. In 2 or 3 years, they would be back to what they had been. In 5 years, they would exceed it. The wall and the hedges together made something I had not quite planned, but found I was very pleased with: a layered boundary, living and permanent together, the masonry giving the structure and the hedges giving the life, each one making the other better. I had not designed it as a composition. I had built the wall for reasons that had nothing to do with aesthetics, but standing there in the evening and looking at what was there, I thought it was probably the best thing on the property, better than either element would have been alone. Claudia Merritt did not run for HOA president when her term ended 6 months after the resolution. She did not attend the meeting at which the new president was elected. The new president was a man named Howard, a landscape contractor who had been in the neighborhood for 12 years and whose primary stated goal was to make the HOA boring again. He sent quarterly newsletters. He organized a neighborhood cleanup day that actually accomplished cleanup. He left people's hedges alone. At the first meeting Howard chaired, he presented the new established plantings protection provision to the community. He explained what it meant, that plantings people had invested years in developing were protected from retroactive restriction. Several homeowners asked questions. Howard answered them clearly. At the end of the discussion, Paul Whitfield, who had repainted his fence and whose property had a beautiful set of rose hedges along his front walk, raised his hand and said he was grateful the provision was in the guidelines. Howard said he thought most people would feel the same way. I sat in the back of that meeting and said nothing, which is my preferred mode at HOA meetings when things are going well. There is nothing to add when things are going well. You sit, you listen, you pay attention, and you leave satisfied that the machinery is running the way it is supposed to run. On the way out, Tom Whitfield stopped me and said he had seen the wall going up and wondered about it, and that now he understood the full story, and that the wall looked good. I said thank you, and that I had tried to build it right. He said it showed. I drove home and made dinner and sat on my back porch and looked at the side of the yard where the wall was and thought about my father, who had built things with his hands his entire life, and who had told me once that the things you build are the clearest record of who you are. Not the things you say, not the positions you hold, not the arguments you win or lose, but the things you build, because they persist and they are honest in a way that language never quite is. The wall is honest. The hedges behind it are honest. The planters on top of the wall, with their cascading plants beginning to trail down the stucco face, are honest. The established plantings protection provision in the Haverford Commons HOA guidelines, which will protect my neighbors' gardens and yards long after I am gone from this house, is honest. Some things, when you build them right, speak for themselves. The wall speaks for itself. Thumbnail text. Line 1, HOA Karen ruined my 17-year hedges, so I built a concrete fortress she legally can never touch. Line 2, then my lawyer found her HOA rules were fake for 6 years, and she lost everything brick's face.